It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10. Our top story. France stops all public transport with another night of violence expected in cities across the country. The French president warns parents to keep their children at home and deploys 45,000 police. We'll be live in Paris. Also tonight, plans to train more doctors and nurses and cut the number of foreign workers. The Prime Minister unveils plans to save the NHS.
Today, we're announcing the most ambitious transformation in the way that we staff the NHS in its history.
I was a nurse in the NHS for 17 years. I was burnt out. I had to leave. I'm never coming back to the UK again.
The story of a teenager taken from his home in Kherson by armed men as Ukraine charges a Russian politician with war crimes. We have a special report.
I felt bad because I didn't like the camp. I was interrogated.
Zach Goldsmith resigns as a Tory minister after being criticised by the Privileges Committee, but says it's because Rishi Sunak has stopped caring about climate change. The leader of the team which found the Titan submersible gives an emotional account of how the search and rescue turned into a recovery operation. And Australia takes charge of the second Ashes test after a poor batting display by England. Plus, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages in our press preview from 10:30. Good evening. The French president sent a message to his people today. Tell your children to stay at home. He's ordered all public transport to stop this evening after 3 nights of violence across the country. But so far, more protests have broken out and many cities are braced for riots once again tonight. The French Interior Minister has confirmed that more than 900 people have been arrested, and local media has reported that a young man died after jumping from a building when it was hit by rioting. Well, the demonstrations were sparked by the killing of a 17-year-old boy in Nanterre, a suburb of Paris, which a police officer has been preliminarily charged for and remains in custody. From there, unrest has spread across the country, with violence flaring in places like Marseille, Bordeaux, Toulouse, Lille and Roubaix, and even reached Belgium's capital, Brussels, where around a dozen people have been detained. Our correspondent, Siobhan Robbins, has tonight's first report.
In France, looters don't even wait for the cover of darkness. Brazenly, they attack this Strasbourg Apple store. The depth of the crisis facing France has become alarmingly clear. Torched cars litter the streets of Nanterre, the suburb where teenager Naël was shot dead by police. The violence following his death has continued to escalate. Over 800 people were arrested following a third night of riots. As anger bubbled over unbound, Jean-Pierre's shop was smashed up. His whole life's work was destroyed in a few minutes. I think they've gone too far. That won't move things forward. It's a bit of senseless violence, he tells me.
The damage here is another clear sign of just how angry people are. But other people are absolutely devastated. I spoke to a lady who's lived in this community for more than 20 years, and she just told me she's really sad. She has never seen violence like this on the streets of her neighbourhood.
As some search for answers, others turn to blame. President Macron's been criticised by a far-right politician for going to an Elton John gig as violence took hold on Wednesday. In turn, following a crisis meeting on the riots, the president's blamed social media for fueling the violence and asked parents to stop teens from joining the protests.
It's the parents' responsibility to keep them at home, and so it's important for the calm of everyone that parental responsibility is fully exercised.
But blame doesn't help residents like Hassan, who are watching their community crumble.
When they break this kind of business and the city, in fact, they are breaking their life too. So
Makes you angry?
Yes.
Niall's shooting ignited the anger, but this MP tells me, despite government denials, it's racism that's fueled it for decades.
There's racism among certain police officers that's been going on for years. So you're 20 times more likely to be stopped by police in France if you're North African or a black African. That's the reality.
45,000 police have been deployed. Buses and trams across the country stopped at 9. As the government tried to regain control, France is bracing for more violence. Siobhan Robbins, Sky News, Nanterre.
And our Europe correspondent Adam Parsons is in Paris for us tonight. And Adam, how is it looking tonight? Is the expectation that there will be more violence?
Not only is that the expectation, I think we are already seeing outbreaks across the country. And I think really interestingly, we're already seeing clashes in the 3 biggest cities in this nation. I'm going to first of all tell you about Marseille, right down there in the south, because there's been some really significant clashes there in the centre of Marseille, including, we're told, a gun store has been attacked there and has been looted. Also in Lyon, and also, I think for the first time during this outbreak, here in Paris, right in the heart of the capital. You can see police vehicles parked up here. We've seen them coming and going. At the moment, we understand, in a shopping district just there, down the road, there is looting happening. And earlier, in Place de la Concorde, which many people will know, as light turned to darkness, there were clashes there between protesters and police. Tear gas, of course, was fired into that crowd, and it took a while for that to be dispersed. Now, I don't want to give the impression that the French capital is tonight seeing the sort of mob violence that we've seen in lots of places, but the mere fact, frankly, that when we just drove up to the Arc de Triomphe and along the Champs-Élysées, you saw lines and lines of police vans, and we've just seen them going along here. It tells its own story about just how nervous this country is. More police out on the streets tonight, more armoured vehicles, more helicopters. But at the same time, what we've heard from the Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, from the President Macron, Prime Minister Elizabeth Borne, really hasn't been a coherent plan about how to stop this disorder. It's been anger, it's been demands for it to stop, but has it really been a master plan? No. And does that mean the disorder is likely to dissipate suddenly? Equally, I think there's no reason to think that's going to happen.
OK, Adam, for the moment, thank you. For a long time, we've been talking about a national health service in crisis. Record waiting lists, cancelled appointments and widespread strike action as workers and the government battle it out over pay and conditions. Now the Prime Minister and the head of the NHS have announced a long-term plan to boost the workforce, promising to train thousands more nurses and medics in the UK, with some learning on the job. But the issue is retaining the staff. We speak to one nurse who has left the UK to work in Australia, saying it was too hard working for the NHS. Our health correspondent Ashish Joshi reports.
Deep breaths.
Dr. Sujay Iyer makes life and death decisions every day. His job is getting harder. As the population grows older and sicker, doctors are being asked to do more with less.
At the moment, the doctors and the nurses together are struggling to provide the kind of state-of-the-art care that we are used to providing. And it's kind of unfortunate that it's come to this.
Here at Wolverhampton's New Cross Hospital, they've introduced fellowship programs to tackle the staffing crisis. Unless something is done, there could be 360,000 NHS vacancies by 2036.
Today, we're announcing the most ambitious transformation in the way that we staff the NHS in its history.
The 15-year government-backed plan aims to recruit and retain over 400,000 more NHS staff.
We need more doctors and nurses to ease the pressures. And we need reform to free them up to do their jobs properly.
Thank you very much. It's hoped extra training places will reduce the reliance on overseas and agency staff.
We've relied on the skills and dedication of staff who came here from the four corners of the globe to care for patients, and there will always be a place for them in the NHS. But demand for healthcare workers is increasing, so doing nothing is not an option.
Thank you very much.
The plan has to deliver for patients and staff, but faces challenges. For the workforce plan to meet its targets, it requires greater productivity and efficiency. But that's a big ask of a workforce which is on its knees after coming through a pandemic and another NHS winter crisis. Even the report's authors say the productivity assumption is ambitious. Over 40,000 nurses have left the NHS since 2018, going abroad or quitting the profession. Caroline Johnson is one of them.
I was a nurse in the NHS for 17 years. I was burnt out. I had to leave. I'm never coming back to the UK again.
After working as an advanced nurse practitioner in London, she moved to Australia.
I get fatigued just thinking about the NHS because of how much we used to work, how hard we used to work, how hard I used to put so much energy into, and feeling like you still didn't achieve enough at the end of the day.
And that low morale can impact patient care. Anastasia has cerebral palsy and has been waiting for a bladder operation for 3 years. She lives in pain and feels forgotten.
I never get a break from it at all. I just wish that somebody would do something for me. I find it tiring chasing up the doctor, and I'm at my wit's end, to be quite honest.
The plan is ambitious, but its targets must be met for the health of the NHS and its patients. Ashish Joshi, Sky News.
Well, the Prime Minister said the workforce plan is the most ambitious transformation of the NHS workforce in its history. But will it fix the current crisis? Our data and forensics correspondent Tom Cheshire has been taking a look.
The NHS is the largest healthcare provider in Europe, but it doesn't have a lot of doctors compared to other countries. In OECD countries, the UK pretty much at the bottom, above just France and Canada, Austria at the top there. Now, that has been the case for a long time. Going back to the 1960s, in fact, you can see it has been below that OECD average. And today in the NHS, there are 112,000 vacancies, a figure that has fluctuated but is pretty much the same as it was 5 years ago. And that's bad enough, but the workforce plan warns that without action, there could be as many as 360,000 vacancies by 2037. So not enough staff at a time when the ageing population is going to expand dramatically. Now, this is the plan to fix all of that. 60,000 more doctors, 170,000 more nurses, and 71,000 other allied health professionals in the period. The NHS also wants to retain more staff, 130,000 over the same timeframe. Now, add all of that together, and it is 431,000 more medical workers by 2036, an increase of around a third compared to today, so a big jump. Now, where does that leave the NHS in that league table? Well, this is the same table. We've taken out some of the countries to compare it. Look at what it does for doctors. We go from the dark blue here, that's where we are today, up to the red, a big jump up that league table. But for nurses, it is barely a rise at all. Those are pretty much the same, even after this workforce plan. Now, crucially, much of the increase is based on new training places and schemes. It's part of a plan to reduce the reliance on medical staff trained overseas. The aim is to halve the proportion from around a quarter today to around 10%. That's because the current plan leaves the NHS exposed to high labour costs and risks the sustainability of services given the growing global demand for skilled healthcare staff. Now, all of that, though, requires cash. And over the next 5 years, there'll be an extra £480 million each year. Now, that is certainly welcome. It represents around 0.3% increase in the total NHS budget. But it is also less than the NHS lost in real terms funding this April when the government chose not to uprate its budget according to inflation.
Earlier this year, we brought you the story of hundreds of thousands of children who are being taken away from their home in Ukraine and taken to Russian territory. The Russians claim they're saving children from war for humanitarian reasons. For the children and their families, it's a nightmare come true. Today, prosecutors in Ukraine brought the first charges against 3 people accused of war crimes over the deportation of children. Ukrainian officials say as many as 300,000 children could have been taken by the Russians and have identified that 19,500 children have been taken. Meanwhile, Russia insists it's evacuated more than 730,000. Sky News has been hearing the story of one teenage boy from Kherson and his mother's desperate effort to bring him home. They've been speaking to our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, who reports now from Kiev.
It's the story of a mother's love for her son and desperate attempt to get him back. In October last year, while Tetiana was out, armed Russians seized 17-year-old Vlad. He was put in body armour and taken away to camps in occupied territory, where he'd be held for the next 8 months.
I missed him and worried about him, especially when there was no communication, when the connection was cut off. I was really concerned. I missed my boy a lot.
Vlad's new life was one of indoctrination by the Russians. In photos he sent his mother, he was beginning to change, taught how to use guns, how to box, here in red in the ring. And there were more worrying signs. Vlad sent her pictures of himself with injuries, a broken leg and finger. There was mental and physical abuse, he says, and when he tried to leave, he was punished.
I felt bad because I didn't like the camp. I was interrogated and asked why I left. I said I wanted to go home, to Ukraine.
The Russians put Vlad into solitary confinement, he says, where he considered killing himself.
It was difficult. 5 days not talking to anyone, and all you see is just someone bringing you food, and you are sitting and thinking what to do. You are just isolated. You don't hear anything. It's like you are deaf. I was thinking about suicide.
Tetiana and a handful of other mothers were helped by a charity to bring their children back. To rescue Vlad, Tetiana would risk a perilous journey, leaving Kherson and driving to Poland and on to Belarus, then flying to Moscow, and overland through Russia by train to Krasnodar and across Crimea to Luzerne in occupied Ukraine, where she was reunited with her son. Describe the moment when you saw him again in the camp.
Tears. Tears. I was crying. I just hugged him and cried. I didn't have any other emotions, just tears running out of my eyes.
But her ordeal wasn't over. The Russians held Tetiana for 6 days and interrogated her for 10 hours, at times sticking a bag over her head.
I had lots of different thoughts. I worried that they could have taken me and I would never have returned. I feared I'd never see any of my children again, not just Vlad.
In the end, the Russians let Vlad and Tetiana go. He's back in Ukraine with his family. But his mother's worries haven't ended. The Russian camps have changed her son, she says, and he can't open up about what happened to him.
It pains me deeply that I've come all this way and he just pushes me away. I feel offended, but I can understand him. And as a mother, I forgive him because I don't know the whole truth about what happened to him. Maybe he's doing this because he just wants to protect me.
The charity that helped Tetiana bring Vlad back says the others left behind in Russian camps are being turned into young Russians to help their war on Ukraine.
I think the worst that these children will be growing with the hate of Ukraine. They will grow and will receive Russian citizenship and will go fight against Ukraine to understand that Ukraine is the evil, is the enemy.
Russia says it's doing all this to rescue children from a war zone.
About 300 children were placed in families, and it wasn't an adoption, but a temporary provisional guardianship or temporary trusteeship.
Ukrainian prosecutors have now accused a Russian and 2 Ukrainian collaborators of taking 48 children, some as young as 1, from this orphanage in Kherson. Vlad may be home, but the trauma inflicted by the Russians is still with him and his mother. And across occupied Ukraine and deep into Russia, so many more like him have yet to come home, and perhaps never will. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Kyiv.
Yesterday, the Environment Minister, Zach Goldsmith, was named as one of a group of politicians who criticised the investigation into whether Boris Johnson misled the House of Commons over Partygate. Today, he resigned from the government and used the opportunity to hit out at the government's recent record on climate change, prompting a very public row with the Prime Minister. Sky's political correspondent Tamara Cohen reports.
Allies in politics and friends outside it, Zach Goldsmith's political career was saved when Boris Johnson gave him a peerage and made him a minister. A multi-millionaire and lifelong environmentalist, he was an influential voice on nature and climate change. Now he's quit, accusing Rishi Sunak of not caring about it. In a scathing letter, he wrote, "The problem is not that the government is hostile to the environment. It's that you, our Prime Minister, are simply uninterested. That signal, or lack of it, has trickled down through Whitehall and caused a kind of paralysis."
Should the Prime Minister come clean about the parties?
It comes just a day after he was criticised by MPs for calling their inquiry into Boris Johnson a kangaroo court and a witch hunt.
Quickly on Lord Goldsmith, he was asked to apologise for his comments about the Privileges Committee, because I felt that those were incompatible with his position as a minister. He's obviously chosen to take a different course. I accept that. I'm proud of the record of this government and indeed of Zach in government.
Zach Goldsmith has denied his resignation is all about Boris Johnson and said on Twitter that he would have apologised for his comments about the inquiry. Some colleagues say he no longer has a hotline to number 10 and feels bruised, but charities and opposition parties have backed him up.
This is a devastating criticism of the failure and negligence of this government on the climate and nature crisis, the biggest issue our country faces. And the tragedy is that their failure on this issue also means higher energy bills, less energy security, fewer jobs for Britain.
As a London MP for several years, he was a headache for the Conservatives, calling a by-election over the decision to build a third runway at Heathrow. Now he's again accusing his party of broken promises and threatens to be a prominent critic when Rishi Sunak has plenty of those already. Tamara Cohen, Sky News, Westminster.
So Lord Goldsmith has accused Rishi Sunak of abandoning his commitment to climate change. Our climate change and energy correspondent, Hannah Thomas-Peter, has been looking into the claims.
Lord Goldsmith has accused the government of stepping off the world stage and withdrawing leadership on climate change and nature. Is there any substance to that? Well, this week, the Independent Climate Change Committee said the government was significantly off track in getting to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. It said progress was worryingly slow and it was markedly less confident than a year ago that the government would reach its targets. The committee said the government's support for new oil and gas in the North Sea was sending confusing signals to the international community about its climate priorities. The government is considering granting more than 100 new licences to drill, including a huge oil field called Rosebank, which could be approved in the coming weeks, despite the UN saying that new extraction is incompatible with limiting global warming. The committee also said that the approval of a new coal mine in Cumbria undermined the careful agreements negotiated by the UK when it hosted COP26 in Glasgow a year and a half ago. When it comes to foreign competition, the UK has enjoyed a reputation as a leader on things like wind power, but there have been growing calls from the renewable industry for more support in response to the huge subsidies packages being offered in America and the EU. Former Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May has just given a speech in which she said, "We have been slow to act in the face of intense competition from abroad, where the UK once led. We are now falling behind." Perhaps the most damaging accusation in Lord Goldsmith's resignation letter was that the government has effectively abandoned an £11 billion pledge to help the most vulnerable countries deal with climate change. Rishi Sunak denied this, but any suggestion the UK won't deliver on such a critical promise could seriously undermine future climate negotiations and this country's influence on them.
Hannah Thomas-Peter there. New documents show Prince Harry is seeking damages of £440,000 against Mirror Group newspapers as his phone hacking trial came to a close. The Duke of Sussex is part of a group suing MGM for using unlawful activity to gather information. The judge, Mr. Justice Fancourt, will deliver his ruling at a later date. The press watchdog has upheld a complaint that an article by Jeremy Clarkson in The Sun was sexist toward the Duchess of Sussex, describing some of the comments about her as pejorative and prejudicial. The ruling is the first time a complaint to the watchdog about sexist discrimination has been upheld. Kevin Spacey has been described in court as a sexual bully who delights in making others feel powerless and uncomfortable. The Oscar-winning actor is on trial at Southwark Crown Court, accused of 12 charges against 4 men, including sexual and indecent assault. He has denied all the charges. The team called in to search for the Titan submersible have revealed they found the debris field at the first attempt searching for the sub. 5 people, including 3 British citizens, died when the vessel imploded in the North Atlantic during a dive to visit the wreck of the Titanic. Our US correspondent Mark Stone reports.
It is now over a week since the debris from Titan was found, and this was the first time we've heard from those at the very heart of a long, hard mission.
I have to apologize, we're still demobilizing. It's a lot of emotions, people are tired.
They had always hoped that it would be a rescue, but too quickly it became clear that it would not.
Shortly after arriving on the seafloor, we discovered the debris of the Titan submersible. Of course, we continued to document the site, and by 12 o'clock, sadly, a rescue turned into a recovery.
This was a chance for the team behind this Odysseus 6K to explain their role, because it was this tethered submersible and the experts who made it and who operate it which allowed a hugely complex recovery to take place. We got a sense of the number of agencies and companies involved. 3 US military transport planes were on hand to fly 32,000 kilograms of equipment from Buffalo, New York to Newfoundland. From there, as part of a non-stop operation that would last 10 days, Odysseus was transported to the search zone.
When we arrived on site, there was a fleet of ships there. We came in next to a ship called Deep Energy, an industry ship. Their vehicle was at 2,700 meters. They were not capable of going deeper.
There were no answers for why Titan's voyage to Titanic went so wrong. That will be for the investigators. Above all, this was a reflection of a tight community of submariners, explorers, marine experts who went to save some of their number, but who in the end could not.
We were focused at the job at hand. That's what we do. That's what all of these people do. We were laser focused on rescue.
With this recovery will come some closure for the families of those on board. Mark Stone, Sky News.
And finally to the Ashes, and Australia have taken control of the second test at Lord's. England were bowled out 325 on day 3, losing their last 6 wickets for just 46 runs, including captain Ben Stokes. Australia were 130 for 2 when rain stopped play, a lead of 221 with 2 days to go. Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview, including The Times, which leads with the ongoing unrest in France and the Foreign Office's advice to British holidaymakers over the extra caution they'll need to take if travelling there. Tonight, we are going to be joined by the Daily Mirror columnist Susie Boniface and the political commentator Benedict Spence. Do stay with us for more. Welcome back. You're watching Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. But first, our top stories. There are a number of protests in France's three biggest cities tonight. The French president has deployed 45,000 officers and public transport has been shut down across the country after 3 nights of rioting. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has insisted he can be trusted with the NHS after announcing ambitious plans to train more staff and cut reliance on foreign workers. And a Ukrainian teenager has told Sky News he was taken by Russians against his will and held for months in a re-education camp. You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the Daily Mirror columnist Susie Boniface and the political commentator Benedict Spence. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, the Times leads with the ongoing unrest in France and the Foreign Office's advice to British holidaymakers over the extra caution they'll need to take if travelling there. The Telegraph says rioting is now spreading across the nation. Here's The Guardian's main story, Lord Goldsmith's resignation from the government over what he called the Prime Minister's apathy towards climate change. According to the Mail, under Rishi Sunak's plans for the health service, newly qualified dentists will be forced to see NHS patients in exchange for their taxpayer-funded training. The Financial Times reports that an investor with an almost 20% stake in Thames Water has given its backing to the firm, the future of which has been called into question in recent days. The Mirror has news from the trial of actor Kevin Spacey, who was today described as a sexual bully. He denies the charges against him. And on what would have been Princess Diana's 62nd birthday, The Express has a story about Princes William and Harry. They're being urged to bury the hatchet. And The Star appears unhappy at the Australian government liberalising their immigration rules to let more Britons go and live there. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Susie Boniface and Benedict Spence. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with the front page of the Mail and this story about dentists being forced to treat NHS patients, this being by way of payback for their study that is taxpayer-funded, partially taxpayer-funded. Susie.
Yeah, so the reason that we have a bit of a problem with NHS dentists in this country is in part due to a Labour policy in 2006, when they were still in power, when they introduced a fairly poor NHS dental contract. Now, the good thing about that is that Labour realised what they had done, and in 2010, when they ran for office again in the general election, they had reforms in their manifesto, which, of course, they never got to enact because the coalition came to power instead. Now, in the 13 years since, no bugger has done anything to sort that out. And you'd have thought that the Conservatives would have had enough time by now, really, to have solved it. Instead, it's got worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. Now, the National Policy Forum, which is how Labour comes up with its policies, has discussed before now, I think only last year, in fact, making dentists sort of stay a bit longer within the NHS so that they can repay the cost of their training. It's something which the Labour Party, under Wes Streeting as Health Secretary, has said they want to give everybody sort of free dental checkups, which is the kind of thing that would require making sure that new trained dentists had to stay in the service a bit longer. So, I mean, it's a good idea. No one's against it. It's just, who's been in charge of the dentists for the last 13 years? And you've got round to it now? What were you waiting for? Because, I mean, the Mirror's been running stories for years now about people pulling out their own teeth because they cannot find an NHS dentist, about people with crowdfunders and GoFundMes to try and get dentures because they can't afford to have replacements put in. It's a shocking state of affairs. Dentistry has been really bad for a long time. It's had historic problems within the NHS since 1948, for goodness sake. It needs sorting out. But to leave it to the last minute, I mean, well done, Rishi, for finally getting round to it. But I mean, what were you up to?
Benedict, is it a case of better late than never?
I mean, Susie says quite rightly, the Tories have been in power for 13 years. I mean, trust me, everything that goes wrong, Conservatives are sort of sat there with their heads in their hands going, oh, good Lord, if only there'd been somebody ostensibly Conservative with a large majority who could have done something about this. It's nice that it is being done. And that's also the case, I think, with the NHS plan, which we'll get to in a second. But again, it's a sort of it's a source of tremendous frustration that sort of right at the tail end of this 13 years of Tory rule, we've got Rishi Sunak in, who's had a bit of a rocket put up underneath him because of the state of the polls. And he is sort of trying to sort of scramble around and do so many different things at once, fight so many fires. And to his credit, I think, of the long reel of Tory prime ministers that we've had, he's probably just about the most competent. I understand it's not a particularly high bar, but he is probably the most competent of the lot. He is doing something about it now. Good for him. But I think, as Susie says, for the benefits of patience, it's far too late in the day. And it's certainly too late in the day, I think, to save his premiership.
Susie, we turn to the Times. They've got a spread on pages 6 to 7 with more on Sunak's NHS proposals to fix the staff shortages.
Yeah, and although, like we said before, it's a good idea, but it's firstly, as Benedict rightly points out, it's not something Rishi Sunak's ever going to benefit from politically. He is going to be well out of office by the time any of these improvements come through, if they do. And unfortunately, what the people who work in the NHS are saying is it's all very well and good to create more people training to throw them into the NHS. But if they are burning out in a very short space of time because they're not paid enough, they're overworked, and there's not enough resources in the place and the buildings are falling down, then they're going to leave again very quickly. And that's not actually, investing in the training is not the only thing you have to do. You have to retain those staff. If you want to cut down, for example, as it says in this plan, if you want to cut the number of foreign people who are recruited to work in the NHS, and that costs a lot of money to recruit abroad, so it's one thing that you could and should try to cut, then you're going to have to find a way to replace staff quickly, not after 4 or 5 years of training, right now in the NHS. And the only way to do that is to suddenly start offering people some golden handshakes to come back who've previously left. And you've got £2.5 billion, and the next government, which is probably going to be Labour, is going to have to find £1 billion within a few years to start funding some of this stuff. But you also need to rebuild an awful lot of hospitals. They've got some very old and very shoddy concrete roofs, which have been found to be not fit for purpose, and they need replacing. So it's a good idea, but it's not enough. It's not going to help Rishi Sunak particularly. I mean, maybe in 10 years' time, we can all look back on it and go, wow, the Tories managed one thing, they suggested this. But I suspect what would happen is when Labour come to power, they would have to tinker and have to do an awful lot more stuff around it as well. And of course, it doesn't address at all one of the fundamental problems in our NHS, which is that bottleneck with getting people who are well but not perfect out into social care, back into the community. We don't have, without a nationalised care service, which we desperately need, we are never going to be able to clear that fundamental problem in the system.
Yes, and one of the major themes, as we've been discussing, is that of retention. And it strikes me that rather than purely forcing people to stay within the NHS, you should make it an environment that they want to stay and they don't decide that the pastures are greener in Australia or the United States.
I mean, the pastures are always going to be greener in Australia and the United States by definition, both because of the weather and the pay. We simply can't offer the pay that these countries can, certainly not compared to the United States. And, that comes down to all sorts of questions around economic growth that we seem completely allergic to. That is one way that you'll be able to retain more NHS staff, is by the country becoming richer and being able to pay NHS staff more. But right now, we're not in a position to do that. And that's because there is no real economic growth. And part of the problem, of course, with that is we have a very large tax burden. So we're in a bit of a difficult situation. Susie is right. This is something that I think actually will be looked back on as one of those sort of rare wins for a modern prime minister, where people go, "Oh yes, that was a very good idea." But I think you can already sort of see the apprehension from the Labour Party. You know, they are saying themselves it's quite late in the day, too little, too late. But they're also not kicking up a song and dance saying we're going to do fantastic things for the NHS. You've got Wes Streeting, who I think is a very mature politician, coming out and saying, "Look, we've got to change the way we think about the NHS, the way we approach it, the way we almost sort of deify it. It's going to take a lot of hard graft, a lot of hard work to get it on its feet," because I think he understands it really is in a very difficult position. And if nothing else, it's simply because the population is aging and more people require it every year. Now, partly that's because medicine is significantly better than it was when we first set up the NHS. It keeps people alive a lot longer. But they aren't being kept in perpetually healthier states. They're just being kept alive a lot longer in a state of chronic illness. That's very expensive to upkeep. So finding alternative sources of funding for this is going to be the calling card. And I think that that'll be the thing that Labour has to grapple with. How do you persuade an already very highly taxed public to part with more money to fund the NHS when they're already really feeling the strain?
Susie, let's turn to the situation in France now. We know that a third night of rioting and disorders is being predicted. Public transport has been stopped across the country, and the Times looking at the situation from UK tourists who are thinking of travelling to the country now.
Yep, so the Foreign Office is advising against the travel, although if you do travel, your insurance apparently still covers you. So I don't know how that works out, and I'm fairly sure the insurance companies will soon find a way to unpick it for us. But yeah, there's probably not a good idea to be out in Paris in the streets late at night these days. But I think that it's, you know, what's happened with the incident that sparked all this, frankly, the murder of a young man at a traffic stop, is always going to lead to riots in pretty much any Western civilized country. That would happen. The officers in question have been arrested. There will be a funeral for that young man in a fairly short space of time, and then things will probably die down a bit as they go through the judicial process. But you also need to bear in mind, I'm afraid, I've been in quite a few riots. I've reported on quite a few riots, and they are always in the summer. They are always when it's hot and when you can have young men out on the streets, tanked up, and it is a nice warm evening. And that's what you've got in Paris at the moment. It's what you're going to have in Paris probably for the next couple of weeks. So I don't think it's going to go away anywhere. And I don't think it's particularly, I'm afraid, super remarkable. I mean, the French do like to riot, and when they do riot, they tend to smash things up a lot more badly than we do when we riot in London. But riots occur when atrocities happen, and I think it's probably a good idea to let people go out and kick off and let some steam out and stuff. But obviously, the police in France, the unions, are calling these vermin on the streets and saying they're at war with their own citizens. President Macron is blaming video games and other things that middle-aged men don't understand. They don't look like they're going to be fixing it anytime soon. But like I said, it is unfortunately quite usual that you do get a riot somewhere when it's hot.
OK, Benedict, we'll get your thoughts on this in the next hour. We're going to take a break now. And coming up, could the backing of a key investor stop Thames Water from drowning in debt? We'll discuss that next.
Play Sky News.
From the Sky News Centre at 7.
Now that you're up to date, we can go into a bit more detail.
Things can change incredibly quickly.
Taken by surprise.
Have you ever known a moment like this in British politics before? Yes. Cheers.
We'll start with breaking news.
Let's get the latest on the ground.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better.
Press Preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
There's a feeling amongst some commentators that it's not the most respectful timing.
I think there's a word for it, fake news.
I mean, it's wow, wow, wow from Harriet. Delving deeper into the stories with different perspectives on tomorrow's headlines.
We really haven't seen the government getting round the table and negotiating. There are no easy answers to those questions.
The Press Preview delivering you tomorrow's news tonight on Sky News.
Welcome back. You are watching the Press Preview. Still with me, Susie Boniface and Benedict Spence. There they are. Let's take a look at the FT weekend and this story about Thames Water, really asking the question, are they going to be OK after all? One of their biggest investors, a 20% stake they have in the utility, they're saying that they've got their backing to turn themselves around. Benedict.
Yes, this is the university's superannuation scheme, which has a 20% stake in Thames Water. And it says that it backs the utility. It says that it backs its plan to turn itself around. I mean, given that it's in a huge amount of debt, one would have to be very confident to say that quite so publicly. But I don't think that this is such a huge surprise in that ultimately water is a fantastic thing to maintain a stake in, especially in a country which is so bad at handling water. I know that that might sound slightly surprising, but you're always going to be able to make some money at some point through water if the population continues to rise and you don't build any more reservoirs. The price of being able to collect it and disperse it is always going to go up. And of course, there is always the prospect that the government will bail you out in response. I think that this FT story is very interesting because it also highlights that other water companies are holding a sort of a powwow, a sort of a roundtable about trying to find ways to stave off the threat of being taken into public ownership. There is said to be an appetite for it amongst the public because the public are very angry. Why? Because they're not very happy that their bills are going up, that huge amounts of water is just being lost to leakage, and also that sewage is being dumped into rivers. So you can sort of understand why a lot of members of the public might be looking at the way that water companies are being run and think, maybe this could be done slightly better if it was brought into public hands. Oh, and by the way, this is kind of an essential natural resource. Why are we chopping it up and allowing money to be taken out of the country and sent to overseas investors and shareholders anyway? So interesting times ahead for the water industry in this country. We wait and see what happens to Thames Water. I suspect it'll be all right. And I imagine it'll probably find a way of not being taken into public ownership, because I don't think actually that's what the Conservatives want. And I don't really think it's necessary, ultimately, if you have large funds, large stakeholders behind it who are prepared to back it. And I mean, Thames Water supposedly is able to raise half a billion of what it was trying to raise earlier in the year. It should be able to find a way out of this. Obviously, this is slightly hopeful thinking, rather.
Yes, and Susie, we read that ministers are actually on standby for potential taxpayer rescue of the group, struggling with rising interest payments on some of its 14 billion debt. Although people close to the utility insist there is no immediate cash crunch.
Yeah, but the issue is that everybody knows the government's going to change. And the attitude that we have had since Thames Water and the other water utilities were privatised and sold off in my youth, it was that long ago, that hasn't worked. Water is a human right, and it's not something that should be part of a profit motive. It just doesn't function very well that way. As we've seen, the investment that they've put in is investment that they've been ordered to do, and which ultimately they ask the customer to pay for. It doesn't come out of their profits. And all that's happened is private equity has come along, loaded these companies with debt, and then run away before they collapse, at which point the government's got to do something about it. There's going to be a change of government, and I suspect if they don't renationalise, one of the things they will probably consider doing is not-for-profit companies, community initiatives, having some way that these must be public interest, public good companies and organisations that don't take a profit and that are run for the benefit of the customers. And frankly, that's what they should be. Without water, we all die. You know, it's like someone was farming the oxygen and letting us have a bit in return for some money. It's not fair or reasonable.
Don't give them any ideas.
They have to wash it and clean it and all the rest of it and collect it and pipe it, but you don't need to make a profit out of it. It shouldn't. That is frankly immoral, and it's led us to the place of where we are. It was not inefficient before it got privatised. It did not have a load of debt before it was privatised. Now it does.
We must leave it there. Thank you very much. You'll have much more to say in the next hour. Let's take a look at the weather for you now.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, the weather remains somewhat changeable this weekend, although the south and east should stay largely dry, with the wetter and windier weather focused further north. For most of Britain, it will be a cloudy and breezy start to Saturday, with some light rain and drizzle, mainly over northern and western hills. Ireland will be brighter with fresh westerly winds. Sunny spells will develop through the day, along with a scattering of showers, some of which could turn heavy and thundery in the north. Brisk winds and more persistent rain will affect northern Scotland and the Northern Isles. By the afternoon, many places will be dry with sunny spells, but blustery showers will continue to affect parts of Scotland, northern England and Northern Ireland. And it's a similar picture on Sunday, with cooler, wetter and unseasonably windy conditions in the north.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Coming up next on Sky News at 11, we'll have the latest from France with reports of riots on a fourth night of unrest across the country.